Story 1. The Oakhaven Harvester. The air in Oakhaven didn't just grow cold. It grew heavy. It carried the scent of wet earth, dead leaves, and something mineral, like old iron mixed with decay. Elias Thorne, a man whose career as an archivist was built on discounting sensational myths, shivered despite his thick wool coat. It was 11:30 p.m. on Halloween. Elias wasn't here for the trick-or-treaters or the drunken campus parties. He was here for the myth of Blackwood Manor, a local legend involving a vanishing family, annual ritualistic fires, and a whispered entity they called the Harvester. It was the perfect historical anomaly for his latest book, and he intended to treat it with the dry skepticism of a man who dealt in facts, not fairy tales. The town itself had offered a bizarre resistance. When he'd checked into the single, dusty motel near the edge of town, the proprietor, a woman named Mrs. Graves, had just stared at him. "You're here for the manor," she'd stated, not asked. "For the history?" "Yes," Elias replied, trying to sound academic. She'd simply said, "If you respect the night respects you. But you've missed the respect window, Mr. Thorne. Best leave before the clock changes." Now, standing before the wrought iron gate of Blackwood Manor, Elias understood her peculiar fear. The house wasn't just old, it felt wrong. It sat far back from the road, a skeletal Gothic silhouette against the sickly, amber light of a half-moon. No lights glowed, no sounds emanated, yet the atmosphere around it felt charged, vibrating with held breath. He pulled a heavy, antique key, acquired from a dubious Oakhaven source for a hefty sum, from his pocket and carefully unlocked the gate. The groan of the iron was deafening in the silence. The entrance hall was a cavern of shadows and stale air. Elias clicked on his powerful LED torch, the beam cutting through the gloom like a solitary, frightened finger. The interior was remarkably preserved, yet suffocatingly dusty. Everything was draped in white sheets. Furniture, portraits, chandeliers, giving the room the look of a graveyard where the stones wore shrouds. Elias made his way to the library, the source of his initial curiosity. Legend held that the first owner, Silas Blackwood, had vanished from the library on Halloween night in 1888, leaving behind only an open book on the occult and a single, dried oak leaf. The library was vast, 2 stories high, lined floor to ceiling with crumbling texts. As Elias scanned the shelves, his torch beam fell upon a small, unmarked door hidden behind a sliding bookcase. This wasn't documented anywhere. Curiosity overpowering caution, he slid the heavy case aside. The door was simple oak, secured by a bolt lock. He used a historical lock-picking set he carried for just such occasions. The tumblers clicked with a dry, metallic finality. Behind the door was a cramped, circular study. In the center, on a simple stone pedestal, lay a single artifact, a leather-bound codex, far older than the house itself, bound with straps of what looked like human leather and clasped with tarnished silver. This was not history. This was myth. Elias placed his torch on a nearby writing desk. He felt a sudden, sharp pressure in his skull, like the ambient atmospheric pressure had just quadrupled. Looking down at the book, he saw that the oak leaf wasn't dried. It was etched onto the cover, a symbol pressed into the grotesque binding. He gently opened the codex. The pages were brittle parchment, covered in a looping, almost organic script that seemed to writhe as he looked at it. It wasn't Latin or Greek. It was a cipher, but Elias, having studied archaic languages, immediately recognized the root structure as pre-Indo-European. Working quickly, translating phonetically as he went, he read the entry marked by the date, October 31st. The Feast of the Threshold. The Oakhaven land requires the payment. The pact holds only if the doorway remains closed and the tithe is recognized. To interrupt the harvester's path is to invite the harvest of all. They walk the fields tonight, looking for the light that signals their keeper has failed. We must remain silent. We must remain dark. We must wait for the hour of 1 o'clock, when the path seals again. A cold sweat broke across Elias's back. He checked his watch. 11:47 p.m. He realized the horror wasn't in the manor. The horror was in the town. They weren't afraid of the house. They were afraid of interfering with whatever ritual had been in place for centuries. Their fear wasn't superstition. It was a grim, learned compliance. The lights outside, the distant sounds of the town, they were muted, suppressed, as if the entire population was holding its breath. Elias looked back at the codex. It detailed a single, protective mechanism. A small, dark wooden locket, hidden within the binding. The locket contained a fragment of bone, the key of the harvest. The key holds the door. Break the key, and the door opens fully. Keep the key intact, and the door may be sealed, but the tithe must be paid yearly. Elias heard a sound from the main hall. Not a creak, but a drag. Something heavy and wet was moving across the polished wood floor. He snatched the codex, ignoring the agonizing pressure now throbbing behind his eyes, and started for the door. But as his hand reached the oak handle, he saw that the bolt lock was engaged again, from the outside. He was trapped. Panic, a sensation alien to his disciplined nature, flooded him. He tried the handle. It didn't turn. He slammed his shoulder against the oak, but the door didn't budge. The dragging sound stopped right outside the library. In the sudden, absolute silence, Elias heard a low, raspy whisper, too close, too distinct to be imagination. It was a voice that sounded like dried leaves being crushed on frozen ground, and it spoke his name. Elias Thorne. The scholar. He spun, torch in hand, scanning the perimeter of the circular room. The beam landed on the only other object in the room. A full-length, antique mirror leaning against the far wall, obscured by a thin, gray dust. The moment the light hit the mirror, the dust moved. It didn't fall off. It peeled back, retracting like a layer of dead skin being shed by something underneath. Elias was staring at his reflection, but it was wrong. His reflection wasn't dusty. It was impossibly dark, a figure carved from pure shadow, yet with features recognizable as his own. Older, gaunter, and possessing eyes that were twin pits of cold, hungry malice. "You seek the truth," the reflection whispered, the sound now echoing inside the small chamber, bypassing his ears entirely. "The truth is a simple arithmetic. A balance. The town pays a small tax, a few loose souls, and the rest are left alone. A fair trade for life, is it not? What are you?" Elias choked out, clutching the codex to his chest. "I am the harvester. And you, Elias, are the interruption." The shadowy figure in the mirror didn't move, but the air around the glass began to condense. Tendrils of black mist, smelling strongly of ozone and burnt wood, crept from the bottom edge of the frame. They moved towards the stone pedestal where the codex had rested, leaving trails of frost on the stone. Elias fumbled with the codex, ripping at the brittle, dry leather straps until he exposed the hidden compartment. Inside, nestled in decaying velvet, was the small, dark wooden locket. He felt the cold emanating from it, not the cold of a cellar, but the profound chill of deep space. "The key is the contract," the harvester's voice hissed. "Destroy it, and the contract ends. But the door opens fully, scholar. Not just here. Not just in Oakhaven. The harvest becomes universal." Elias realized his terrible dilemma. The townspeople, who had seemed merely superstitious, were acting as centuries of gatekeepers, sacrificing a few random souls each year to keep the bulk of humanity safe. Now, he, the skeptical man of reason, was holding the mechanism that could either seal the deal for another year, or break the entire world's protection. He looked at the shadow in the mirror. It was now pulling itself out of the reflective surface, not as a reflection, but as a three-dimensional being made of solidified darkness and static electricity. Its hands, long and skeletal, ended in claws that scraped the stone floor. 11:58 p.m. He had minutes. He had two choices. Choice A: keep the key intact. He could attempt to perform the sealing ritual described vaguely later in the Codex, a complicated process requiring blood and specific chance, which would ensure his and the town's immediate survival, but condemn Oakhaven to the annual tithe forever. Choice B: break the key. Destroy the locket and the bone fragment within. The Harvester claimed this would break the pact, but also unleash it fully. The risk was unimaginable, but the moral cost of sustaining a dark sacrifice was higher for Elias. The knowledge you seek is the price, the Harvester rasped, now standing fully in the room, towering over Elias. Its presence was a physical weight. Give me the key. I will take your soul as the tithe, and Oakhaven will return to the rhythm of dread. Elias looked at the locket, small and insignificant, yet holding the balance of immense, ancient horror. He thought of Mrs. Graves, the motel owner, her eyes holding a deep, exhausted sorrow. He thought of the quiet compliance of the whole town. They had simply forgotten why they complied, knowing only that they must. He was not a man of rituals. He was a man of endings. With a yell that ripped his throat, Elias slammed the wooden locket against the sharp stone edge of the pedestal. The wood shattered instantly. The bone fragment inside, which felt unnaturally dense, splintered into 3 pieces. The reaction was immediate and absolute. The Harvester stopped. The black mist that formed its body didn't dissipate. It recoiled violently, pulling itself back into the mirror with a sound like tearing metal. A sonic boom of pure silence hit the room. The pressure in Elias's skull vanished. The stench of ozone cleared, replaced by the faint, normal smell of old paper and mildew. But the house was not silent. It began to shake. Not a tremor, but a convulsion. Dust and plaster rained down from the ceiling. The ancient timbers groaned, and the heavy leather-bound books tumbled from the shelves like dominoes. Elias scrambled back to the secret door, fumbling with his torch. He kicked the shattered lock and rammed his shoulder against the door again. This time, it flew open, its latch pulverized. He ran. He sprinted through the library, through the shrouded main hall, the massive oak doors buckling inward as the manor began to consume itself. He didn't look back as he burst out into the night, the freezing air a welcome shock to his lungs. He reached the gate just as the entire roofline of Blackwood Manor collapsed inward with a deafening roar, sending a column of dust and smoke into the moonlit sky. He ran, not stopping until he reached the town limits. When Elias finally stumbled back to the motel, breathless and covered in dust, his watch read 12:05 a.m., November 1st. He paid for his room, packed his bag, and didn't look at Mrs. Graves, who was polishing a coffee urn behind the counter. As he reached his car, she finally spoke, her voice flat and utterly devoid of emotion. "It's quiet this morning," she said. Elias stopped, his hand on the car door handle. The town was quiet. Too quiet. A grim, expectant silence hung over the empty streets. He looked back at the empty space where the manor had stood. "The key is broken, Mrs. Graves," he said, his voice raw. "The contract is void." Mrs. Graves paused her polishing. Her eyes, ancient and knowing, finally looked at him. "When you break a cage, Mr. Thorne," she replied, "you don't free the trapped. You free the hungry." Elias drove out of Oakhaven and never looked in his rearview mirror. He was a man who still dealt in facts, but now he had a new, terrifying data point. The ancient, grotesque codex was still clutched in the passenger seat beside him, a reminder that the great, unknowable balance had been disrupted. He was the last man to interrupt the harvest. And he was the first man to carry the consequence. The pressure in his skull was gone, but the cold, hungry malice he had seen in the mirror had left a trace. Now, when Elias looked at his own reflection, his eyes seemed impossibly dark. And sometimes, in the absolute silence of his study, he thought he could hear the faint, eternal sound of leaves dragging across frozen ground, searching for the next, great, universal payment. The night, now, had his number. The veil was broken. The harvest was coming. Story 2. The silence of Atheria. The town of Atheria existed in a state of suspended animation. It wasn't dull, exactly, but profoundly smooth. Its buildings were freshly painted, the lawns were immaculate, and every resident possessed an unnerving, open-faced cheerfulness that felt less like contentment and more like a carefully maintained blank slate. Atheria was a place where nothing bad had ever happened, or, more accurately, a place where everything bad had been meticulously sanded down to the grain. Clara Ashworth, an aspiring architectural historian recently relocated from the frantic noise of the city, had chosen Atheria precisely for its stillness. She'd inherited a small, sturdy stone house built in 1890, right next to the town's only official monument, the Atheria Historical Society, a towering, red brick Victorian building that looked oddly sturdy among the surrounding bungalows. Her first assignment, self-appointed, was to catalog the Historical Society's archive. Mr. Finch, the town's ancient, perpetually smiling director, had practically thrown the keys at her. "We love history here, Miss Ashworth," Finch had chirped, his skin pulled taut over his skull like old parchment. "But we prefer to keep it tidy. You'll find the main records room perfectly organized. Just focus on the pleasant parts. The founding, the harvest festival. Nothing dramatic." Finch's instruction, "Nothing dramatic," was the first crack in Atheria's veneer of perfection. Clara began her work in early October. The main archive was bright, temperature-controlled, and utterly sterile. It held documents detailing property lines, birth records, and glowing accounts of local prosperity. Yet, there were glaring omissions. The archive spanned 150 years, but there was almost no record of death, disaster, or social upheaval. Where were the obituaries? The records of the 1918 flu epidemic? The accounts of the Great Depression? Atheria's history was, impossibly, a straight, unblemished line of success. One afternoon, seeking the original architectural blueprints for her own inherited stone house, Clara found a discrepancy. The Society's floor plan showed a large storage closet beneath the main staircase that did not exist in the physical building. Intrigued, Clara investigated the closet's location. The wall was a new application of drywall, covering old stone. She located a faint seam and, applying a little focused force, found a hidden latch. The latch opened onto a flight of narrow, damp stone steps descending into a chilling darkness. The air that rose from the stairwell was not merely cold. It was suffocatingly heavy, smelling strongly of sulfur, ozone, and dried, old blood. This was the true archive. The subterranean repository. Clara descended cautiously, illuminating the space with her heavy-duty lantern. The basement was massive, a pre-Victorian vault with vaulted brick ceilings, clearly predating the town itself. This space hadn't been drywalled over, it had been forgotten, or deliberately abandoned. The basement was not organized. It was interred. Instead of shelves, there were crude, high-walled alcoves carved into the damp stone. Within these alcoves lay artifacts wrapped in heavy, yellowed linen and secured with ancient wax seals. These seals bore a symbol Clara had never seen in the main archives. A stylized, multi-layered spiral that looked unsettlingly like a human intestinal tract. As she moved deeper into the vault, a pervasive, low humming began to resonate through the stone floor and into her bones. It was a sound of immense, pressurized energy. The humming led her to the center of the chamber, where the source of the noise resided, a colossal, ornate copper cylinder. It stood over 10 feet tall, its surface covered in the same spiral glyphs that marked the sealed relics. It looked like a giant, antique steam boiler, yet its function was clearly not industrial. It was an object of terrifying, arcane preservation. Clara circled the reel, as she immediately dubbed it. It was hot to the touch, and the air around it felt dense, almost viscous. The sheer size of the cylinder spoke of an equally immense tragedy that Atheria had tried to contain. As she examined the base, she found a small, iron-plated hatch, sealed with a brass combination lock. On the hatch, etched deeply into the metal, was a single date, October 31st. The tapeworm feeds Clara spent the next week in a feverish, hidden exploration of the basement. She worked when Finch was gone, stealing away to the subterranean vault. She began unwrapping the sealed linen shrouds in the alcoves. The artifacts were not relics of celebration. They were fragments of tragedy, preserved and hidden. One shroud contained a pile of children's toys, charred and fused into a single lump of melted plastic and wood. Another held a stack of mildewed diaries, all dated 1927, their pages stained with brackish water. The writing was frantic, detailing a 3-day storm and a massive flood. But the final entry was always the same: it is better to forget the water. The water will be forgotten. A third contained a handful of human teeth and bone fragments, clearly victims of some tremendous, unrecorded event. As Clara handled these objects, she didn't just feel their history. She felt the memory associated with them. Holding the charred toys, she felt a terrifying, white-hot flash of panic, saw the fleeting image of a house consumed by flames, and heard the distant, muffled scream of a child. She realized the nature of the horror. Atheria wasn't prosperous because it was blessed. It was peaceful because it was lobotomized. The town had suffered devastating, repeated tragedies, but every time, a pact had been renewed, and the painful collective memory of the event was physically extracted and stored. The copper cylinder, the reel, was a repository, yes, but it was also a host. A tapeworm of memory, fed by the town's anguish. The more memory the reel absorbed, the less integrated Atheria became with its own timeline. This explained the smooth, blank cheerfulness of the locals. They were living in a constant, happy present, stripped of the painful context that creates true depth and resilience. But the memory wasn't simply stored. It was consumed. The librarian's vigil. Clara knew Finch held the key, literally and figuratively. She confronted him in the main archive on the morning of October 30th. "Mr. Finch, I found the basement archive," Clara stated, holding up one of the mold-flecked diaries. "The flood of 27. The fire of 55. The town forgot these. You made them forget." Finch's usual cheerful mask did not crack. It simply hardened, his smile becoming a skeletal rictus. "Ah, Miss Ashworth," he said, gently taking the diary and placing it on his desk. "Such unnecessary drama. We don't forget, exactly. We choose not to dwell." He leaned closer. His eyes, which Clara now noticed were a watery, unsettling gray, fixed on her. Atheria was once like other towns. It had the usual miseries, the usual pain. But one year, long ago, we had a tragedy so overwhelming, so final, that the few survivors could not move forward. They were locked in a perpetual cycle of grief and madness. Finch picked up a heavy, old ledger, one of the few items from the main archive with a date predating 1900. The founders discovered that the land itself did not want to hold the memory of such suffering. The Earth provided a mechanism for ontological discharge. The real, Miss Ashworth. It is a digestive system for collective trauma. On the last night of the harvest, Halloween, when the mental boundaries are thinnest, the real must be open to ingest the year's residual stress, the tiny anxieties and small griefs that accumulate. Why? Why does it need to feed? Clara demanded. Because if it does not feed, it purges, Finch hissed, his voice dropping to a dry rasp. It doesn't just release the memories it holds. It releases the psychic residue of the things that caused the memory. The fire, the plague, the madness. It reintroduces the cause back into the town, but magnified by the century of suffering it has consumed. Finch held up the key to the iron hatch, an antique thing of twisted silver and brass. Tonight is the night. If the real is not opened, if the tapeworm is not fed its annual dose of minor, forgettable grief, it will vomit up the great misery, the original, town-destroying trauma, and this time, nothing will remain to contain it. Clara looked at the innocent, sunny town outside the window. She saw Mrs. Gable watering her petunias, Mr. Harris jogging past with a wave. They were happy. They were safe. But they were hollow. The 0 hour 11 p.m., October 31st, St. Clara watched from the darkened window of her house. The town was eerily silent. There were no lights except for the occasional porch lamp. Atheria did not celebrate Halloween. It braced for it. The low, resonant hum coming from the Historical Society was now a deep, grinding throb. Sea-elvinging to the edge of the archive, Clara slipped back down into the basement. Finch was already there, standing before the colossal copper cylinder, his face illuminated by the flickering light of a single tallow candle. He held the silver key, his hand shaking slightly. The atmosphere in the vault was now actively hostile. The sulfur smell was intense, and the walls were coated in a fine, unsettling layer of condensation. The alcoves holding the interred tragedy were beginning to weep a dark, viscous fluid. "You have to leave, Miss Ashworth," Finch ordered, his voice echoing. "The feed is dangerous. The entity within the real, it isn't fully contained. It's the distillation of all the pain of this place, waiting for its meal." "What is the meal, Finch?" Clara asked, refusing to move. "The residual burden," Finch replied, turning the key in the brass lock with a dreadful, metallic screech. "The low-grade suffering. The arguments, the small fears, the fleeting moments of existential dread the town has built up over the past year. It is the price of their ignorance. I must open the vessel, and they must feel the draw." The iron hatch clicked open, revealing a small, circular aperture. A plume of hot, fetid air rushed out, smelling like burnt sugar and decaying meat. Inside the cylinder, visible in the faint candlelight, was not machinery, but something organic. It looked like a massive, coiled spinal column, wet and glistening, segmented by the copper rings of the container. It was slow, lethargic, and ancient. It was the tapeworm of memory. Finch stepped back, his face contorted in a silent plea. "Now, the town must pay. Stand still, Miss Ashworth. Resist the draw, or you will be pulled in." The extraction, the humming stopped. It was replaced by a sound that defied description, a deep, resonant, psychic inhalation. Clara felt it instantly. A sickening, internal vacuum. It was not pulling air or energy, but specific concepts from her mind. The fleeting embarrassment of a failed presentation she gave 5 years ago. The acute anxiety of a traffic jam she endured last week. The sharp sting of a harsh word she spoke to a loved one months ago. She saw the townspeople, miles away, lying silently in their beds, their faces twitching. The extraction was invisible, painless to them, because it was only taking the shallowest layers of their emotional lives. But the sight through her eyes was terrifying. The black, sticky fluid on the walls of the alcoves, the concentrated great misery, was starting to flow towards the real, attracted by the powerful suction. Clara looked at the tapeworm, at the slow, consuming coil within the copper shell. She realized the terrible, beautiful mechanism of the town's forced peace. By feeding it the minor grief, they kept it contained, lethargic, and ensured it didn't awaken the great misery. If she closed the hatch, the tapeworm would starve, awaken, and purge the century of suffering it held. If she let Finch proceed, the town would remain hollow, but stable. But as the vacuum intensified, a fragment of memory that wasn't hers, one too deep and too painful to be absorbed, flashed into her consciousness. It was the memory of a young woman, perhaps the original keeper, standing here in this vault, her face alight with terror. He didn't take the misery. He took the lesson. He took the reason why we should never do it again. Clara understood. The tapeworm didn't just remove pain. It removed wisdom. Atheria was perpetually stuck in its cycle because it never retained the ability to learn from its mistakes. The smooth, blank happiness was a prelude to the next inevitable tragedy. Finch stood paralyzed, his eyes wide, mesmerized by the aperture. He was the most vulnerable, holding the most memory, and the real was drawing heavily from his withered soul. Clara moved. She didn't try to close the hatch. She knew the magnetic suction was too powerful now. She ran to the alcoves, grabbing the diary of the flood of 27, its mildewed pages falling apart in her hands. "Stop this, Finch," she screamed, holding the book high. "If you take the small grief, the great grief remains trapped. But if you force it to consume the source of the misery, the source is destroyed." Finch didn't respond. He was a statue of extracted agony. Clara took a running jump and, ignoring the crushing vacuum trying to rip the diary from her grasp, she thrust the book, the physical, tangible record of the great trauma, through the open hatch and into the glistening coil of the tapeworm. The coil didn't consume the diary, it rejected it. The creature inside the real convulsed, thrashing against the copper walls. The deep psychic inhalation instantly reversed into a violent, thunderous exhalation, a psychic vomit. The great misery of Atheria didn't just leak out, it exploded. Clara was thrown back against the stone wall as the massive cylinder began to vibrate uncontrollably. The air filled with a nauseating sensory overload. She was instantly overwhelmed. She felt the burning skin of the child in the fire of 55. She felt the cold, crushing despair of the flood victim drowning in the attic in 27. She tasted the metal tang of blood and fear from the unnamed accident that claimed the bone fragments. A century of suppressed, collective suffering, magnified by the tapeworm's internal pressure, was released directly into her mind. The psychic wave hit Finch first. His eyes rolled back, and he let out a thin, drawn-out wail that was abruptly silenced as his body crumpled. He had borne too much memory for too long. The sudden purge shattered him. Clara stumbled to her feet, her own mind reeling from the bombardment. She looked at the reel. The coiled tapeworm was shriveling, its glistening segments turning to ash. The ingestion of the flood diary, the source of a great trauma, was fatal to it. The reel could store misery, but it could not consume the truth. She ran up the basement stairs and burst out into the night. The town was no longer silent. It was screaming. Every house was suddenly alight. People were running into the streets in their nightclothes, not in panic, but in acute, unbearable realization. Mrs. Gable stood on her porch, tears streaming down her face, clutching her chest. She wasn't sad. She was remembering the agonizing loss of her only son in the forgotten fire of 55. Mr. Harris had stopped jogging and was kneeling on the asphalt, his hands over his ears, remembering the 3 days he spent trapped in the attic during the flood of 27. The town wasn't forgotten anymore. It was integrated. The collective trauma, so long suppressed, hit them with the force of a tidal wave, giving them back their history, but stripping away their manufactured peace. As Clara stood in the center of the street, watching the town suffer its long-delayed, necessary grief, she looked back at the historical society. The humming had stopped entirely. The copper cylinder was silent, inert. The tapeworm was dead. Atheria was finally, truly, awake. The price of memory. Clara left Atheria 3 days later. The town hadn't tried to stop her. They were too busy remembering. The clean, bright aesthetic was already fading. Walls were being scrubbed to reveal fire damage. Petunias were being pulled up to expose mud stains. The forced smile of Atheria was replaced by the haggard, exhausted look of a place dealing with a century's worth of deferred pain. The historical society was sealed, the basement vault left untouched, the copper cylinder now just a silent, empty shell. Clara carried only one thing. The silver and brass key to the hatch, the key Finch had dropped. She found a note Finch had slipped into her pocket before the purge began, written on a brittle slip of paper. You chose the memory, Miss Ashworth. The memory protects. The memory provides the lesson. But you must carry the burden of the tapeworm's death. It needs a host to decompose. It needs a place to lay its final seed. Back in her city apartment, Clara tried to resume her life. But when she woke up in the dark, she didn't just carry her own memories. She remembered everything. She remembered the scent of burning kerosene from the 55 fire. She remembered the specific terror of the 1927 floodwater rising around her waist. She remembered the names and faces of the children who died. The tapeworm had failed to consume the truth, but in its death throes, it had found a new repository. Clara's mind, the mind of the outsider who introduced the fatal truth, was now the new, living, and infinitely expanding archive of Atheria's grief. She looked in the mirror. Her eyes were not dark like Elias Thorne's, but wide, constantly reflective, holding the agony of 100 years of human suffering. She had saved the town from oblivion, but she had become the vessel for all the tragedy that oblivion was meant to hide. Clara touched her temple, feeling the immense, silent weight of the memories of strangers. She was no longer just Clara Ashworth. She was the archivist of necessary agony. And somewhere, hidden deep in the archives of her mind, the dead tapeworm's essence began to twitch, waiting for the world's pain to accumulate, waiting for its next, inevitable feed. Thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure to subscribe, like, comment and turn on notifications if you enjoyed the video so you never miss an upload.